Betrayal begins with a fake smile, the kind people think no one notices. It shows up in the smallest ways first, in the way someone's expression lingers a second too long, or how their voice takes on that soft, syrupy tone meant to hide what they're really thinking. She'd seen that smile before, years ago in situations far more dangerous than any neighborhood disagreement. Back then it came from people who wanted something. Access, information, a favor. Here, it came from people who wanted control of a community newsletter and the right to decide which hedges were 2 inches too tall. But the pattern was the same, and she recognized it immediately. It started the afternoon she walked into the clubhouse for what she assumed would be a simple discussion about parking violations and lawn upkeep. The moment she stepped in, she felt the temperature shift. People who used to wave at her barely nodded. Conversations dropped when she passed. And at the center of the room sat 3 residents who smiled with an almost painful politeness. Their smiles were tight, polished, and rehearsed. That was the first warning. You don't rehearse something unless you plan to use it. She took a seat and let the room settle. The 3 of them leaned in with that warm, overly accommodating tone that always means trouble. They thanked her for her service, not the military one they pretended to honor, but the committee work she never asked for. They said they valued her contributions, which sounded more like a courtesy than a truth. She listened, knowing the compliments weren't compliments. They were padding for whatever they were about to drop. The first speaker pulled out a folder. Paper clipped, tabbed, and highlighted. That alone told its own story. No one prepares that much unless a decision has already been made behind closed doors. The smile on her face didn't match the weight of the file in her hands. It was a smile meant to distract, to soften the impact, to make everything seem collaborative. But you can't hide intent from someone who's been trained to read tone shifts and micro-movements like maps. She caught the tiny twitch at the corner of the woman's mouth, the way her eyes never quite matched the expression. That's where betrayal always shows up first, in the mismatch between the face and the truth. Then came the second smile, the one from the man who always claimed to hate drama, but somehow created the most of it. He leaned back in his chair as if everything unfolding was natural, inevitable, harmless. His grin was the kind people use right before they slip a knife between the ribs of someone's reputation. He made a small joke at her expense, pretending it was lighthearted. A few people laughed too quickly. That was another signal. Quick, nervous laughter isn't amusement, it's alignment. It's a sign someone has already chosen a side. The third member of the trio gave her the worst kind of smile, the sympathetic one. The smile that says, politely and sweetly, that they have already moved on without you. She thanked her again for all she'd done, while her fingers tapped a rhythm on the table that didn't match her words. That rhythm was impatience. They wanted her out, and the smile was there to make it seem like an unfortunate necessity rather than a planned move. What most people don't realize is that a smile can be an announcement. It can say, "We've already met without you." It can say, "Your turn is over." It can say, "We've decided who we are and who you are, and those 2 things no longer fit." People think betrayal arrives loudly, but it usually comes in on quiet feet, with polite expressions. It arrives in the way someone waits for you to speak, so they can contradict you. In the way they nod enthusiastically while you talk, only to present emotion that undoes everything you've proposed. In the way they exchange quick glances with each other, not realizing how visible those glances are to someone trained to watch hands and eyes more than mouths. She sat through all of it, letting them perform their version of civility. Every smile, every nod, every carefully phrased comment went into a mental file. Fake smiles aren't harmless, they're tools. And when enough of them show up in the same room, they mark the moment when people stop treating you as part of the group and start treating you as a problem to be handled. She wasn't just a neighbor. She had a seal's memory, the kind shaped by years of watching people say one thing and mean another. It wasn't photographic, not in the way people imagine, but it was precise. She could recall tone, posture, timing, contradictions tucked into casual sentences, and the exact moment someone shifted from honest to strategic. Memory like that doesn't switch off when you leave the military. It follows you home and settles into everyday life, showing up when someone hesitates before answering a simple question or when a story changes halfway through a meeting. She didn't flaunt it. Most people never noticed it was there. But it was the quiet skill that shaped every interaction she had inside that tidy, rule-obsessed community. She had learned long ago that people reveal themselves in patterns. Not grand gestures, not dramatic confessions, but the small repetitions they think no one tracks. She noticed who always volunteered loudly but never followed through, who avoided conflict unless it was behind someone's back, who agreed with her in private then aligned with whoever was louder in public. None of this surprised her. Civilian life was calmer, but the dynamics weren't so different from the high-pressure rooms she used to sit in overseas. Just fewer uniforms and more HOA newsletters. She also remembered conversations with unusual clarity, especially the ones wrapped in excessive politeness. The group that turned on her had forgotten every promise they'd made when they first asked her to join. They forgot saying they wanted someone organized, someone steady, someone who didn't crumble under pressure. She didn't forget. She remembered the night they came to her door with concerns about rising tension in the community and how they praised her level head. She remembered how relieved they'd been when she agreed to help, as if they'd finally found someone who could keep things fair. Now those same people acted like she'd pushed herself into a position they suddenly claimed she wasn't suited for. She didn't need to argue with them. She only needed to observe the shift. Her memory extended beyond words. She picked up on physical cues others overlooked. She saw when someone straightened a stack of papers not because they were neat, but because they needed something to do with their hands while lying. She noticed when someone glanced at a door to see if a person who held their allegiance was walking in. She noticed the subtle tension that flickered across someone's jaw when a topic came up they had previously tried to bury. None of it was dramatic, but it was enough to map the entire room. When you've spent years reading people for survival, reading them for politics about landscaping guidelines is effortless. The SEAL training also taught her to trust what repeated itself. She remembered the early warning signs from months before, long before the meeting where everything came to the surface. She remembered the moment a neighbor asked a question that was too specific, one they couldn't have known unless someone shared something meant to stay in confidence. She remembered the sudden shift in tone during email threads, the ones that started friendly and ended clipped. She remembered a committee member using a phrase she had only spoken privately to one person. Small leaks like that meant information had been traveling through channels she hadn't agreed to. Even casual conversation stuck with her. She recalled how one woman had asked whether she was comfortable with leadership roles, pretending it was small talk, while fishing for doubts. She recalled how another resident complimented her attention to detail in a tone that wasn't admiration but caution. She recalled how two board members stopped greeting her with the easy warmth they'd once had, choosing instead a stiffer, more controlled greeting that signaled distance. People think these shifts are invisible. They never are. Her memory wasn't sentimental. It wasn't about holding grudges. It was about tracking cause and effect. If someone changed their behavior, she remembered when, how, and what preceded it. That clarity helped her see betrayal long before it became official. She didn't need to be told they were planning a move against her. She already knew. She had the timeline in her head, each moment marked with a detail others would have dismissed as nothing. She wasn't intimidating in the way people stereotype former military leaders. She didn't bark orders or correct people sharply. She observed. She waited. She remembered exactly who said what, when they said it, and how it conflicted with the version they later tried to present. That was what made the group so uneasy around her. They weren't afraid of her rank or her background. They were afraid she saw more than they intended to show, and that she would not forget the moments they hoped would disappear into the blur of community noise. They thought she'd fold. She didn't. They counted on it, actually. They assumed the quiet one would step back the moment things got uncomfortable, that she'd take the hint when the group began pushing her to the edge of the conversation. In most neighborhoods, that's exactly how it goes. Someone raises concerns, someone else disagrees, and the person with less patience or less social backing eventually gives up for the sake of peace. But peace meant something different to her. It wasn't the absence of conflict. It was the presence of fairness, and she had no intention of stepping aside just because a few people preferred decisions made in whispered hallways instead of open meetings. The whole thing began with a small disagreement about budgets. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would signal how quickly the tone would shift. She pointed out gaps in the numbers, tiny inconsistencies she figured were oversights. Instead of fixing them, the group reacted with surprise, as if her noticing the issues meant she had overstepped. They tried the common tactic first: overwhelm her with charm. The soft voices, the patient explanations, the repeated assurance that everything was fine if she'd just relax. They expected her to nod along. They expected her to accept their version of events even when the facts didn't line up. That was the first sign they didn't understand her at all. When charm failed, they moved to subtle pressure. Meetings were suddenly held without notice. Documents went missing. A few friendly neighbors began avoiding her, not because they disliked her, but because someone else had suggested she was becoming difficult. That phrase circulated fast. It always does. It's the community equivalent of a smoke signal. If enough people repeat it, others believe it without checking the source. They were certain she wouldn't fight that kind of rumor. Most people don't. Most try to fix it socially, which only makes the rumor look true. She knew better. She ignored the noise and paid attention to what changed, who changed, and why. Then they tried to wear her down with procedure. Endless revisions. Sudden rule interpretations. Conversations that felt like mazes designed to keep her looping back to the same non-answer. They counted on fatigue. They counted on her patience running out. They counted on the idea that she'd rather walk away than stay caught in a long, slow grind. But she'd lived through far worse than bureaucratic stalling. Patience wasn't a weakness for her. It was a skill. She saw every tactic for what it was, and that understanding kept her steady. People often assume confrontation means raised voices and dramatic scenes. But the fight here wasn't loud. It was quiet persistence. It was her showing up to every meeting, even when invitations were sent late. It was her bringing printed records when others planned to catch her unprepared. It was her asking simple questions they couldn't answer without exposing their inconsistencies. Every time they pushed, she stayed calm. That calmness rattled them more than any argument could have. They expected frustration, and they got discipline. They expected emotion, and they got clarity. The moment things shifted was subtle. It happened on a Tuesday evening when the committee gathered to finalize a decision about reallocating funds. They believed she'd finally give in. They presented the plan with soft voices and careful phrasing, waiting for her to nod in reluctant acceptance. Instead, she opened a notebook and read their previous statements back to them, word for word. Not in an accusatory tone, just steady and factual. She pointed out each contradiction, each timeline that didn't line up, each detail they had blurred hoping no one would look closely. She didn't embellish. She didn't raise her voice. She simply laid out the truth in the order she had witnessed it. The room changed. People who had been confident 10 minutes earlier started shifting in their chairs. Some avoided her eyes. Others flipped through papers hoping to find something that would rescue their earlier claims. No one said she was wrong. They couldn't. They had underestimated what a calm mind paired with strong memory could do to a narrative built on convenience. They had expected her to fold, to let social pressure outweigh facts. Instead, she held her ground with the same steadiness she had carried through far more serious situations in her past. She didn't win anyone over with speeches or emotion. She simply refused to disappear. She didn't meet their tactics with matching aggression. She met them with consistency. And consistency has a way of exposing what people hoped would stay hidden. They had expected an easy victory, but what they got was someone who couldn't be quietly pushed out of place, someone who had already seen the strategy they were using long before they tried it. Every lie they told came with a receipt, and she kept track of each one without needing to write anything down. She listened to the way people phrased things, how they softened their claims at first, then hardened them later, shifting the story inch by inch until it barely resembled the original version. The group didn't think anyone would notice. They assumed their words would blend into the usual community chatter, forgotten as soon as the meeting ended. But she remembered the exact wording from the night they first asked her to join, the promises they made about transparency, fairness, and shared responsibility. She remembered the tone, the timing, and the sincerity they tried so hard to project. When the same people began contradicting themselves, it didn't slip past her. She caught it the way someone else might catch a strange smell in a familiar room. It started with small things, the kind people often dismiss. One person claimed a document had been reviewed by the entire committee. She remembered the conversation days earlier when that same person said they hadn't had time to look at it. Another insisted a rule had been in place for years, even though she had the original copy of the handbook and knew the rule hadn't existed until 3 weeks prior. When she mentioned the discrepancy, the person smiled and brushed it off, pretending it was a misunderstanding. But misunderstandings don't usually repeat, and this one did, again and again. She knew the pattern well. Lies often begin as gentle adjustments. A little reshaping of a timeline, a small redirection of responsibility, a vague phrase meant to blur the edges of what actually happened. But when someone gets away with the first adjustment, they try bigger ones. Soon the story grows legs, then a spine, then becomes a creature so different from the truth that it stands on its own. They told each new version with more confidence than the last, as if confidence alone could turn fiction into fact. She didn't challenge them in the moment. That was part of the receipt-keeping. You let the story settle. You let the teller get comfortable. You wait until the lie has enough weight behind it that they can't pretend it was just confusion. She wasn't interested in embarrassing anyone. She was interested in accuracy. If the group was making decisions on behalf of the community, the truth mattered more than anyone's pride. One night during a budget discussion, a board member claimed she had approved a line item that she knew she had questioned from the start. She remembered emailing about it, asking for clarification that never came. She remembered the exact phrasing of her message because she had crafted it carefully, wanting to avoid assumptions. When he insisted she must have forgotten, she didn't argue. She simply pulled up the email on her phone, read the lines aloud, and set the device on the table. The room went quiet. He didn't apologize. People rarely do when caught. But he stopped insisting. Another time, someone tried to claim she had missed an important meeting. She remembered not only attending, but being the one who took notes because the designated note-taker never showed. The notes were still saved in a folder she kept on her laptop. She remembered who sat where, who arrived late, and who stepped out halfway through. When they tried to rewrite the event, she let them finish their version before calmly providing the actual one. Again, no argument followed, just discomfort. People don't like being reminded that their stories have borders they can't stretch forever. The more they bent the truth, the more obvious it became who was working together behind the scenes. Their stories aligned too neatly, repeating the same phrasing as if they had rehearsed. The same pauses, the same emphasis, the same attempt to redirect blame toward her without saying it outright. She knew coordinated storytelling when she saw it. It didn't surprise her. Groups under pressure often resort to shared narratives to protect themselves. But she also knew that shared narratives create shared openings, places where the seams don't line up. Those seams are where receipts live. She kept everything simple. She didn't make accusations. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't match their attempts to twist the story. She just held on to the truth long enough for it to reveal the shape of the room. For her, keeping receipts wasn't about winning. It was about clarity. It was about making sure no one could claim confusion or memory lapses to justify decisions made in shadows. It was about making sure every quiet inconsistency eventually found its way to the surface. And the group eventually realized that once she heard something, once she saw something, once someone tried to alter the truth in front of her, it never disappeared from her mind. Every lie, no matter how small, had its place. Every contradiction had its timestamp. Every attempt to rewrite her part in the story sat quietly in her memory, waiting for the moment it would be needed. Quiet people keep the sharpest records, and she was the kind who never announced what she noticed. She didn't need to. She collected information the way some people collect loose change, picking it up without effort and keeping it until it mattered. She didn't gossip. She didn't trade details for leverage. She simply observed life around her with the kind of calm attention that made nothing slip past. Most of the community thought her silence meant she wasn't paying attention. They mistook her steady presence for detachment. They thought she drifted at the edges of conversations instead of listening to every word. They couldn't have been more wrong. Her quiet didn't come from shyness or uncertainty. It came from habit. In her past career, talking too much could complicate things. Listening, on the other hand, offered clarity. She learned that people reveal more when they think no one's recording the moment. They relax. They speak freely. They forget the version of themselves they try to project. In the neighborhood, she used the same approach without meaning to. Old instincts settle in like muscle memory. Someone would give an excuse that didn't match their previous one. Someone else would claim a decision had been unanimous when she remembered clear disagreement. Another would insist a rule had always been enforced when she knew exactly when it was added. None of it was dramatic, but it all stacked slowly into a picture that didn't match the one the board tried to paint. Whenever the group held meetings, she stayed quiet for the first few minutes. People interpreted that quiet as agreement or passiveness, but she used those minutes to read the room. The way someone sat, where their eyes moved, how they shifted when a topic landed closer to something they'd rather avoid. People say the truth is in the words, but she knew it was in the small signals people send when they think no one is keeping track of them. She noticed when someone winced at a phrase, which often meant the phrase touched something real. She noticed when two people exchanged quick glances, which meant they had already discussed the topic privately. She noticed when someone looked down at their notes before answering a simple question, a sign they had rehearsed more than they wanted others to know. She kept mental files on how people behaved when calm and how they behaved when cornered. One board member, always composed, had a habit of tapping one finger whenever he was stretching the truth. Another, who preferred to sound decisive, always cleared her throat before delivering something she wanted the group to accept without questioning. Another spoke in circles whenever he hoped to hide a detail, repeating the same phrases as if repetition would make them sound factual. None of them knew these habits were visible to her. They assumed their performances worked. They assumed she was swallowing their explanations whole. Her silence made her easy to underestimate. People forget that listening is its own form of presence. When she sat at a table, she didn't need to dominate the discussion. She absorbed the details others missed in their rush to sound informed. She remembered who changed their stance depending on who was in the room. She remembered who only spoke up when the group felt safe. She remembered the moments when tension cracked through someone's voice even if their words stayed smooth. The board thought they could steer the narrative, but every shift, every inconsistency, every attempt at soft manipulation echoed a little louder when people thought no one heard it. The most interesting part was that she rarely corrected anyone right away. That patience made her seem agreeable, even cooperative. But her quiet wasn't approval, it was observation. She let people speak long enough to show their entire hand. Someone might twist a timeline on Monday, confident no one remembered the original. She did. Someone else might add a rule they claimed had been there for years. She knew it hadn't. Someone might frame a conversation as confrontational even when it had been routine. She remembered the tone, the pace, and the lack of raised voices. The truth stayed intact in her mind even when others tried to sand down the edges. Quiet people also know when someone is acting out of fear. They can hear hesitation inside bold statements. They can feel when a person's confidence drops half an inch before their posture catches up. She could tell who was speaking from conviction and who was speaking because they were trying to protect themselves from consequences. Those subtle differences mattered more than the loud opinions the board loved to toss around. The group thought they controlled the flow of information by controlling the conversation. But she didn't need control of the conversation. She only needed to pay attention. Her quiet record-keeping became a kind of internal map, showing her exactly where things were heading long before the rest of the neighborhood realized something was wrong. She didn't brag about noticing the lies. She didn't point fingers or warn people she saw patterns forming. She simply held the truth steady in her memory, letting everyone else build their stories around it. And while they crafted versions meant to protect themselves, she sat there listening, watching, storing every detail, knowing that the person who keeps the clearest records is usually the one others expect the least. The reckoning wasn't loud, but it was final in a way that didn't need volume. It happened slowly, through small shifts in the room that most people wouldn't have noticed. The group expected a showdown. They imagined raised voices, a heated argument, maybe someone storming out. They thought conflict always needed noise. But she'd been shaped by a world where decisive moments usually arrived quietly, guided by preparation rather than impulse. When everything finally came together, it felt less like a confrontation and more like a curtain lifting on what had been true all along. It began during a meeting the board scheduled at an odd hour, the kind meant to limit attendance. They thought the smaller the audience, the easier it would be to push through the narrative they'd been building. They arrived early, arranging papers and whispering among themselves. When she walked in, the room hushed for a moment, then tried to reset itself. One member greeted her with a voice too cheerful. Another offered a seat that wasn't usually hers, trying to reposition the dynamic before the discussion even began. She noticed the changes, but she didn't react. She sat where she always sat, opened her notebook, and waited. The first attempt came wrapped in polite phrasing. A board member suggested there had been concerns about her involvement. Another followed with a gentle remark about miscommunications. Someone else hinted that her presence had complicated recent decisions. They expected her to defend herself or deny the claims. They expected tension to rise. She didn't give them what they expected. She simply looked at each person as they spoke, letting their wording land without interruption. When they finished, she reached into her folder and set a stack of printed documents on the table. The group hadn't seen her bring the folder in. They hadn't considered she might come prepared with physical records. She slid one page forward, then another, each one labeled with dates and quotes from previous meetings and emails. She didn't rush. She didn't lecture. She just placed the evidence in a line, quietly, until the papers formed a timeline that contradicted every claim they had just made. One by one, the board members reviewed the pages. They recognized their own words. They saw the discrepancies. They couldn't argue with their own signatures or timestamps. The room shifted. The person who had spoken the most confidently leaned back and folded his arms, a gesture meant to show calm but revealing discomfort. Another tapped her pen in short, uneven bursts. A third went silent altogether, the kind of silence that comes when someone realizes their version of events can't hold its shape any longer. She didn't narrate the evidence. She didn't need to. The papers spoke for themselves. Each one showed a promise, a contradiction, or a decision made without the transparency the board claimed to value. She let them read without pressure. She didn't try to corner anyone. She didn't push for admission. She allowed the truth to do its own work. The quiet stretched on longer than usual. Someone tried to recover the narrative by insisting the documents didn't capture the spirit of the decisions. Another claimed the misunderstandings had been unintentional, but the words lacked strength. The papers on the table had taken the weight out of the room. The board tried to shift the discussion to future plans, hoping to move past the uncomfortable moment. She didn't stop them. She just continued to listen, the same way she always had. Then the second shift happened. It came from the people who weren't part of the board, but had attended out of curiosity. They had heard rumors. They had wondered why the tone of the community had changed. They watched the exchange with focused eyes. These residents had no interest in politics. They cared about fairness. And what they saw didn't match the stories they'd been told. They saw who had come prepared. They saw who deflected. They saw who avoided eye contact and who held steady without aggression. Their perception of the board changed in that moment, and the board felt it. The meeting continued, but the balance had already moved. The authority the group carried so easily before didn't carry the same weight now. Their decisions, once accepted without question, now had a spotlight on them. Their explanations sounded thinner. Their confidence dimmed at the edges. She didn't celebrate. She didn't gloat. She simply remained in her seat, steady, letting the room recalibrate on its own. By the end of that evening, nothing dramatic had happened, yet everything had. The board realized they couldn't push her aside with quiet pressure anymore. They realized the story they'd been building didn't survive contact with facts. They realized the person they thought they could outmaneuver had been paying attention from the start, quietly gathering details that now sat between them like a mirror they couldn't avoid.